I'm doing a series of interviews with leaders from different communities and from different industries, because I've noticed that obviously as we start to watch other countries ease out of the quarantine, we're also starting to move closer to that. And a lot of us are asking ourselves the question, what does this mean? Like, what does the future look like? And I think that we are sometimes a little bit beholden to, what do other people tell us it'll be like, but we are also part of that decision, each one of us. And I think it's also interesting to talk to different people because I want to create a cross community and cross industry conversation. I think that listening to someone like you speak about food security and farming is relevant to, say, someone who owns a restaurant, and actually relevant to me who likes to eat food. So let's talk about that. I wanted to just start by saying that I read your article in the National Observer, which is quite something. And I'll just quote a little bit of what was in it, which I think is really relevant. It said that the World Food Programme has identified 49 countries at high risk of experiencing food crises because of COVID-19. And that means that 307 million people who are food insecure are at risk, who live in those countries. And in fact, that the impact of COVID-19 on our food security may be in fact worse than the disease itself, which is saying something. So I think the first question I have for you, Jane, is, first of all, I'd love you to introduce yourself and explain what SeedChange is, please.
Sure. So yeah, Jane Rabinowicz, Executive Director of SeedChange. We are a Canada-based international cooperation organization that's been around for quite some time, since 1945. And our mission is to build food sovereignty by saving seed diversity, spreading sustainable farming, and working to counter inequity in the food system. And we work hand in hand with farmers across Canada and also around the world in their fields, and then also around the policy table to advance policies that will help spread and scale the solutions that farmers are innovating on the ground.
So you say that as someone who really knows her world, obviously. Can you explain to the rest of us what does food sovereignty actually mean, and why should I care as an individual? How does that affect me?
Right. So I'll start by talking about food security. So food security is basically the ability of everybody in all places at all times to access enough food that they have choice over, so that meets their cultural and personal kind of requirements for a healthy and productive life. So it's really about enough food to eat for anybody, anywhere, and that there's choice in the food that people are eating in a way that meets, their individual requirements, whatever those might be. So that's what people may be more familiar with, is this whole notion of food security. Food sovereignty expands to include all of that, so everything that's connected with food security, but also the rights of the people who are growing the food, the rights of the people involved in the food system at every level. So not just farmers, but farm workers, people who are working in processing, everybody who's involved in the food system from the production end of things all the way to the consumer. And then also that we're producing in our food in harmony with nature, so that our food production and our food systems are delivering the food that people need, and are doing so in a way that also maintains the health of our ecosystems.
That's no small thing. I mean, that last sentence, that we actually produce food in harmony with nature, goes against the established food systems, as we know.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing the cracks, this is a conversation about COVID-19 and the impacts on food systems. And I mean, every single day we are hearing a new story about, and it's impacts on the food system, but I would say it's more like the vulnerabilities or the issues in the food system that have basically been revealed through the crisis, that have been there for so long, and that are at every level. So it's food insecurity. So the impacts of losing jobs. One of the first things is, well, am I going to, do I have enough resources now to feed myself and my family? And just the number of food insecure Canadians, like the article that I wrote was about the global food crisis, but the same is true in Canada. The number of food insecure Canadians has increased so much. because of loss of income due to COVID-19.
Do you have any numbers on that, or where we can find some information?
I can send you, yeah, I can send you information, but it's exacerbated inequity that was already there. So low income people, racialized people, Indigenous people are disproportionately impacted as well. And so again, that's just on the consumer side, but the food system impacts, it's across the board.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the Canadian experience? Like, do you have any information also? I mean, I think definitely we would like to know about how is Canada set up to cope? I know that I've noticed a lot of the, I know there are programs in place now for Quebec farmers to get help from regular people. And I also read that that's, you know, a little bit daunting for them, because obviously, you know, for us, it's, hey, I went and worked on a farm for a few hours, but they're used to people working 12 to 16 hours a day coming from, I think, South America, it mentioned. So how are we potentially seeing an issue here in Canada? And do you know, and specifically in Quebec?
Yeah, a lot of what's being experienced in Quebec is mirrored across the country. I mean, and one of the things I would say is that what the crisis has revealed is just how interconnected we all are. So how reliant we are in Canada on a globalized food system. So like the average Canadian, Quebecer, had probably never thought about temporary foreign workers until this crisis. And yet it's one of the first impacts, and what it shows us is how important these people are for our daily food security. You know, and these are these are people who are not well cared for in our system. So it's this combination, again, of like so important to us. Previously not part of the conversation, and really heavily impacted by the crisis. And so, yeah, I mean, that's just one example. The concentration in the meat processing industry, you know, 95% of the meat that we eat in this country comes through 3 facilities in Alberta. None of them are Canadian owned. You know, that's another example of the globalized nature of the food system and how reliant we are on, you know, external forces that may not have our best interests at heart. So, and then, you know, seeds, like we have just seen such a massive increase in folks who want to grow their own food. Local seed producers in Canada are experiencing like 6 to 10 times an increase in interest for seed. They're selling out, they're delayed on their shipments, all of this stuff. It's like amazing upswell in interest in people growing their own food. Like learning also that the vast majority of vegetable seed, like almost all of the vegetable seed that's planted on farms across the country, is imported. And so if we close our borders and if there's disruptions to international trade, we may not in future be able to access those seeds, and that makes our food supply vulnerable as well. So it's really revealed, yeah, like it's, I mean, again, it's revealed these issues that many of us who have been working in this field have been aware of for a long time. It's made them, you know, so stark to people who don't think about this stuff all day, every day. And it gives us a lot of, like, we have to learn from it. I've heard somebody say COVID-19 is a dry run for climate change. So like, through this crisis, we have seen where the vulnerabilities in our food system are, and we have an opportunity to address them. And the good news is that when we're thinking about recovery, we need to approach recovery in the food system in a way that's also going to build resilience to climate change. And those solutions already exist.
So where, if you had to start somewhere, I know that the Canadian government has given, I think it was almost 160 million, you know, to other countries to help them combat this. But where would you begin if you had a magic wand and you could start in one place to help boost our food resilience, our security?
Yeah. I mean, so one place, woo, I
I
mean,
know. You can also tell me that
um,
to dream on.
well, I think again, it depends at what level you're looking at. If you're looking at, you know, what are the consumer facing stuff or the producer facing stuff. I work mostly on the production side of things. So I would say on the production side of things, just really looking at removing the barriers to thriving regional food systems. And so, for example, if we just take the meat issue, which again is really front and center right now, there are a lot of operators across the country that are ready to be operating kind of like regional or local like abattoirs and processing plants and stuff like that, that are focusing on high health and safety standards, that focus on sustainability, that pay workers well, and that are delivering a really high quality product. But those operators face huge barriers in terms of policy. And it's like simple things like an abattoir is required to have both, you know, male and female bathrooms in case like for inspectors that come and visit, or like weird kind of infrastructure requirements and other kind of policy barriers that could actually be easily addressed, that would allow for a much more decentralized processing and distribution system. That would mean that if like one part goes down, others
Can
continue.
thrive.
Others can, like, it's others can pick up the slack and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Like again, in this case, there's such a high degree of concentration that when one part goes down, that's 45% of the meat or the beef that Canadians are consuming. So a lot of what a lot of what the crisis reveals is about resilience. And resilience is really about how do you deal with shocks to the system. So like how impactful is a shock to the system? How able are you to weather the storm and then also recover? And one of the most important elements that builds resilience, like in an ecosystem, in a food system, in a human system, like in any kind of system, is diversity.
And decentralization, it sounds like.
Exactly, like a diversity of operators of different scales, different types, different regions, all of these things. Like when you have that kind of diversity in your system, you're going to be much more resilient
I
to
find
shock.
it sorry to interrupt. I find it fascinating that overall, we've understood how deeply we're interconnected. And we've understood that in order to, you know, survive a pandemic such as this one or any future ones that we might see, that we're all going to need to collaborate. Governments, communities, people at every single level. And yet, on the other side of it, we need to collaborate, but we need to remain independent. So we need our, whether it's our manufacturing or our food systems, one thing we've really found is that this excess globalization has in fact left us less resilient because the focus was so much on, you know, economic efficacy. So it's so interesting. It's a real dichotomy of we are connected, we need each other, but we shouldn't be so dependent on each other.
Yeah.
So you've partly answered the next question I have, but if you have anything to add, I'd be curious to hear it. So the question is, how do you think this pandemic will, well, you've told me how it is affecting, but how do you think it'll affect the farming or food security worlds in the long run? And I know that you wrote a little bit about women
Mm-hmm.
and the impact on women. And that is also something that's coming up, whether it's in tech or in food, or even watching friends of mine where all of a sudden gender roles have come back because necessity. So I'm very curious about that as well. So how
Yeah.
would you say that this pandemic has affected food security as a whole, or farming, whichever angle of it you choose to respond
Mm-hmm.
to?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think how it's affected, I mean, we've talked about impacts on farmers and farm workers with the temporary foreign, like what happens when borders close. And so impacts on our ability to produce food because of limitations on labor. And then we've talked about processing. So what happens when you have such a concentrated processing industry that is handling such a high volume of our food, again, and unable really to comply with health and safety restrictions that have been important as a result of the pandemic. Like what happens when you have a situation like that and the link goes down. We've talked about, on the smaller end of things, like smaller scale diversified ecological farms are more environmentally resilient, and they are part of a more localized food system that is able to kind of care for itself through crisis. But a lot of those, but it's fragile and it's a small part of our food system still in Canada. And a lot of those farms have lost 100% of revenue when restaurants have closed, right? And so they've really had to pivot, selling online, doing direct to consumer, CSA. Those same farms have been really impacted by the closure of farmers markets across the country. So there's been a big kind of outcry to declare farmers markets essential services. And so that has been successful in some places and less so in others.
Can I interrupt you for one
Yeah.
sec? That's interesting because I was reading yesterday about how in the US, the farmers were dumping millions of pounds of potatoes, of milk, etc., and that Papa John's, one of the pizza chains in the States, has now asked each of their franchises to double the cheese on every pizza ordered. These funny, interesting, small ways of actually making a difference, and it's cut the waste of milk by obviously millions of gallons.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is where there's some positives. Like I really, the way that consumers are supporting local business, the way that consumers have changed their eating habits to support local farmers is like amazing. The interest for people like in growing their own food is amazing. Just the sense of like solidarity and specifically around local food systems has been enormous. And then just like the ingenuity of like farmers and restaurants and all folks in the food system to raise money, channel money to folks who are most affected. And then also to like use, like I know of an example here in Quebec, like using a kitchen in a hotel that's been closed to make frozen meals out of meat that would otherwise go to waste, and then donate those meals to a food bank. And I think they're going to be making something like 1 million meals. And so,
do you know which organization that is?
I forget what what the thing is called, but I know that John Winter Russell from Conzied is involved. He was telling me
all right,
about it.
I'll look it up.
So there are just these like amazing, like I'm equally troubled by everything that's happening as I am inspired by this incredible, I've never seen impacts at this scale in my career, like on the food system. And I've also never seen people as aware of the issues in the food system as now and as responsive. So my only hope is that carries through. That some of it carries through beyond the crisis.
So that actually leads me to my next question, which is, how would you like this pandemic to change the industry?
I think we need to be, the way that the agriculture sector in Canada, we talk specifically about agriculture, the way that the agriculture sector in Canada, it functions, it's really about, delivering food, international trade, it's an economic kind of industry, obviously, like contributing to our, to Canada's economy, all of these things. Environmental sustainability and climate resilience is not prioritized. And food production for export is prioritized over food production for domestic consumption. And so I think what we need to see moving forward is like, yes, talking about trade, talking about the economics of farming, all of these things, but integrating a much stronger emphasis on resilience and specifically climate resilience into the system so that we are able to like weather future shocks. And to stop thinking that comes with an economic trade-off. because the reality is that the system already wasn't working. Less than 1% of Canadians farm. The average age of a farmer is 55. The total accumulated farm debt in Canada is $106 billion. And there are so many supports that go out to farmers to help them, from the government, to help them make ends meet. So the whole viability, like the viability of the sector from an environmental point of view, and then also from a livelihoods of the people involved point of view, like it already wasn't working.
Yeah.
And so I think, again, like moving forward, we need to be pairing those other indicators, like the social indicators and the environmental indicators, on putting them on the same level as the economic indicators when we're talking about food production.
Which again, I mean, no matter what industry you're talking about, it seems to be the key reminder of this pandemic. Economics cannot govern all. We need to have shared values about how we treat human beings, whether we're talking about basic income or we're talking about food security. That's really seems to be the lesson that's coming back. I'm curious about one thing you said, which is that Canada has prioritized exporting food over domestic food production. Why is that? Is that because most of our food was imported?
I think
How can we afford to do that?
Right. I mean, Canada is like our prairie provinces are really well suited to growing a huge amount of grain and really high quality grain, and way more than we could consume here in Canada. So we have the acreage and the landscape and just the setup where that has made a lot of sense to go in that direction. And it still will be part of the system in future. Like, I think anyone who says that it should be just all about it's, small scale, diversified, mixed farms like dotted across the countryside, it's just a kind of romantic vision. It's a naive point of view. Like, that's not how things are going to happen. But it's like what you said earlier. We have to be striking a balance. So there will always be stuff that we grow here, that we produce here, that makes sense to export. And we need to make sure that those crops, that's actually where a huge amount of potential lies in terms of sustainability, because that's where most of the acreage is in the large scale operations. So a lot of the time, like at the consumer level or in cities, we think about like the local food systems and CSAs and all of that, because that's what we're closest to and that's what we engage with. But there's such huge potential on large scale farms to integrate more sustainable practices. And if that happens on a large scale farm, you have a massive impact immediately.
What do you mean by, can you give one simple example of what a sustainable practice would look like on a large farm?
Sure. So let's say you've got like a 10,000 acre grain farm in Saskatchewan, and you're growing, a couple different grains. Like if you intercrop, for example, so if you've got rows of, wheat or something like that, and then in between your row of wheat, you've got clover or something like that, which is a nitrogen fixer, which is a plant that enhances the quality of your soil. You're going to be helping to build up your soil quality without needing, let's say, like a chemical fertilizer, which creates a lot of greenhouse gas emissions when you produce it and when you apply it.
Oh, I see. Okay.
One of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture is the production and use of synthetic inputs, which are pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, all of that stuff. But if you implement really good practices on the farm, like intercropping or crop rotations, because different crops take different things from the soil and contribute different things from the soil. So you really deplete your soil quality if you plant the same crop on a given field year after year after year after year. The way that you build up fertility and soil health is to rotate crops. So you've got your crop rotation where you're in your planning, you're thinking multiple years ahead, and you're moving your things around so that you're building soil over time. And when you do that, you really decrease your need for those kinds of chemical inputs, which has multiple benefits. Like you're much less of an impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, much improved impact in terms of human health, because a lot of those products are also toxic.
Yeah.
And it's also better for your livelihood because your cost goes down as a farmer.
I don't think I've ever learned quite so much about farming. It's actually, but it's fascinating. And when you talk about crop rotation, I think all I could think was, I mean, I knew that, and I've never farmed, and it's the only thing any of us has ever learned, you know, is all of this idea of like either leaving a field to regenerate, or to actually rotate crops. And it's amazing that we've let these systems go. Two last questions. One would be, can you talk briefly about the impact, as you mentioned in your article, many of these small farmers in rural areas and in the Southern Hemisphere specifically are women.
Mm-hmm.
They eat last, they usually have a lower social status, their work is in the fields. What is this doing to them?
Yeah, I mean, as we've seen here, like anyone who was already vulnerable prior to the pandemic has been made more vulnerable as a result of the pandemic. And so women in the global South, in particular, so rural women in the global South were already vulnerable. So more at risk of domestic violence, as you say, you know, eat last. A lot of the time women don't control money. So even if the household is earning money based on women's work, by selling, for example, like the food a woman produces, it's the man of the household that controls the money. In some cases, it's illegal for women to own land. So they don't have, you know, those kinds of assets. And now what's interesting in the pandemic is that like women's roles and leadership are more important than ever, because of women being traditionally the ones who do the household gardening, like who run the family gardens and stuff like that, home gardens. And so if trade is disrupted, even if it's local trade, like community to community because of restrictions on mobility, those home gardens are going to be much more important for food security for the family. And they're also going to be more important in terms of selling. So women's roles in food production and their leadership is more important than ever. Women are also traditionally the seed stewards. And so, you know, passing the seeds down generation after generation, you know, women being the stewards of future life as we are in general. And so that role is particularly important, again, because the seed is the source of the future food. And so when you have a good seed supply in the community, you know that you've got the tools that you need to have a harvest today, but also tomorrow. And that's one of women's traditional roles as well. So the leadership of women in this particular moment is more important than ever. And then conversely, you know, their vulnerability is enhanced. So any kind of one of the positive things about Canada's you know, approach right now is our feminist international assistance policy. We have a named feminist approach to international cooperation, where there's an acknowledgement about like just the reality that when you uplift women, you uplift everybody. And that also, you know, women face very significant systematic barriers, in particular in the global South. And so Canada already has that kind of feminist approach to international cooperation, and it's really important in the response to COVID-19 that response be gendered, and that we consider, again, like the incredible leadership that women are needing to show right now, and also the extreme barriers and dangers that they're facing during the pandemic.
Am I right to think that that is a revolution in itself, to have a named feminist, like the Canadian, this is a Canadian government initiative?
Yeah, it's our international assistance policy. Like we are
And it's
just
called,
the feminist international, Canada's feminist international assistance policy. Yeah, I mean, it really is something, and it's really positive in terms of just the approach that the government of Canada and then Canadian civil society organizations take to international cooperation, but it also is really important as a symbol on the global stage. When you have a head of state who is a man, who is a self-proclaimed feminist, and who has supported a feminist international assistance policy, like it does send a signal to partner countries about this, and it does do something different when it's coming from a male head of state.
and I suppose what it means is that it requires a central role for women in whatever policies they support and uphold.
Yeah, it's not just about women as beneficiaries, it's about women around the decision-making table at all levels.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, my last question goes back a little bit to what you had said, which is that I'd like you to tell me, what is it that you and I can continue to do in order to keep supporting food security for others, our food systems? Can you remind us what some of these things are that we can do as individuals are?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, any farmer will tell you that their farm, their operation is a business, and they need a market in order for it to be viable. And sustainable local producers need that market. So it really, really makes a difference how you shop and where you get your food from. So just as much as possible to be supporting small business, to be supporting local businesses, to be supporting, if you eat out. I know we're all very excited to go out to eat when this is over, to be eating in places that that prioritize ethical sourcing. If you can, buy direct from farmers, like shortening the supply chain, really make sure that more of the profit goes to the producer. So if you can shop at farmers markets, if you can do a CSA, that kind of thing.
CSA?
Community supported agriculture. Sorry, it's those weekly baskets.
I get one. I just started a Second Life, and I was Loofah before, but now they're really overrun, which is nice to see. But I've started Second Life because I heard about them, coming directly from the farmer. So
yeah, that's really important.
Something.
Yeah, and the good thing about those baskets as well is that you pay up front, as I'm sure you just did. So either, half or in full. And what that means is like you're sharing the risk with the farmer. And farming is all about risk management. So basically what you're saying is no matter what happens this summer, if there's an act of God, if there's, who knows what crops succeed, what crops fail, whatever happens, like I'm in this with you for the growing season ahead. And it gives the farmer a certain amount of income security, which we all need. So that really makes a huge difference. At the political level, SeedChange is part of a growing coalition of progressive agricultural organizations in Canada called Farmers for Climate Solutions, which is all about supporting farmer leadership in spreading climate solutions in agriculture, which is really, really important. And so folks who are interested, I would say, visit farmersforclimatesolutions.ca. There's a pledge for supporters, follow us on social media. So you can act with your dollar and how you buy. And you can also add your voice to farmers who are advocating for more resilience in the food system as well.
That is wonderful. Thank you. And it's empowering too. I think we always want to know, and I always want to know, how do we do something useful that can actually support something good as well, including eating. I mean, it is harder. It is harder right now to, even just to find places where some places have better access to veggies and stuff. And it's something that I've definitely noticed. So I think that's it. Is there anything else that you'd like to say to your community or to ours?
I guess I would just want to say, just don't forget the power of food. And, you know, that's why I've chosen to work in this field for so long. It's like food is just so powerful at every level in terms of like how we nourish ourselves. I know everybody misses like having a meal with friends right now. So just like, you know, the power of food to bring us together. You know, the power of food as an environmental vehicle, the power of food in terms of like generating good livelihoods for people, all of this stuff. And then also, you know, how marginalizing it is for people when they can't afford good healthy food for their family and stuff like that. So engaging in food system activities in whatever way you do, like as a consumer, as a citizen, whatever it is, it is one of the most powerful things that you can do.
Thank you so much, Jane. Thank you
My
very much
pleasure.
for your time. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Nice chatting with you.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.